Daf Kuf Amud Aleph will begin Sadi Tes Amud Beis, 2 lines from the bottom. If water, if you bought a body of water, the top layers of the water are considered munach. It's all considered munach in that area where the water is. So for instance, if you have a bore, which is a pit which is 10 deep and 4 wide, it's Rishus Hayachid. The water that's on the bottom of the bore is considered munach and Rishus Hayachid. The water that's on the top levels, the higher levels, that is also considered munach. It's considered munach on the bottom. We view the body of water as one chayfetz, as one mass. So just like the bottom layer is on the Rishus Hayachid, it's resting on the bottom. The water on top is also considered resting on the bottom. Similar, if you would take any chayfetz, if a person would take a ball and put it at the bottom of a bore, the bottom of the ball is resting on in that rishus. It's resting on the bottom of the pit. The top of the ball is as well. Here also, the water, the body of water, is considered all one. So the water, the top levels, the layers of water on the top are considered munach. It's also considered munach. But if you have a nut on top of the water, it's not considered munach. And therefore, if you remove the nut that's floating on top of the water, it's not considered an akira, because since the nut is not considered stationary, it's not considered to be one with the water. They're two separate items, and it's not considered resting. It's floating and bobbing up and down. It's not munach, and therefore removing it from that water is not considered an akira. So if there's a nut floating on a body of water that's in a bore, that's in Rishus Hayachid, removing that nut and placing the Rishus Rabim, the person is not chayiv. It's not considered an akira. Boy, Ravi had the following shaila: egas b'kli. Well, let's say the nut is in a container, in a kli. V'kli tzafal gabi mayim ma'u, and the kli is floating on the water. Now, the kli floating on the water is not considered munach. Just like a nut floating on the water is not considered munach. But if you have a nut in the kli and the kli is on the water, what's it in? Ma'u. Do we look at it from the viewpoint of the nut? The nut is considered stationary. It's not bobbing up and down. It's not jumping up and down. It's stationary. It's resting on the kli. So do we consider the nut, therefore, from that vantage point to be munach? And therefore, if someone removes it, it's considered an akira. Or do we say it, but ultimately it is in the kli, and the kli is on the water, and the kli is not munach, so therefore the ego is also not munach. Tekum. It's a tekum. If you have oil on wine, is that considered one, or is that considered two separate items? Is it considered, for instance, like water, the upper levels, layers of the water, that are considered all one with the lower layers of water, and it's considered munach? Or is the oil on the wine considered like a nut on the water? Machlekes Rav Yochanan ben Nuri v'Rabbanan. It's only on the machlekes. This non-shemet shesafal gabi yayin, if you have oil that's floating on wine. V'naga tful yaim b'shemen, and the tful yaim touches the shemen. Tful yaim is somebody who was tummy. He was mitai. He went to the mikveh. He has a partial tahara. So at that point, he's considered a tful yaim. He's not completely tahar until nightfall. So he's not tummy anymore in the sense that he cannot make things, if he touches something, he does not make it tummy anymore. So for instance, a person came into contact with the sheretz, he became tummy. He went to the mikveh, but it's not yet nightfall. So now, the person, if he touches an item, he does not make it anymore tummy, and therefore it cannot be metama other items. But if he touches truma, he will passel the truma. He will make the truma passel. Not that the truma can be metama something else. It doesn't transfer it. It doesn't extend it further. But the truma itself will become passel and it cannot be eaten. So if you have a v'nogat tfulyan b'shemen, if you touch the shemen, loy pasel el shemen. The Chum say the shemen and the wine are not considered one and the same. If he touches the shemen of truma becomes possible, but not the wine. But Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, but he says no, it's considered connected, it's considered one, and touching the shemen is as if it constitutes touching the wine as well, and therefore the wine also becomes possible. So this would be the same machlokes l'gabe Shabbos. According to the Chachamim, the oil and the wine are not considered one, so therefore it's not, the oil is not considered a munach, and if somebody skims off that oil, it's not an akira because it never was munach. But according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, it's considered a chibur, and it's considered munach, and therefore he would be chai. If you have a pit in the Rishus Harabim Amukasora, which is 10 deep, and 8 wide, so it has the dimensions of Rishus Yochid. You threw Marcellus into it, chai. You threw the Marcellus into it, it landed in the bore. If you threw it from the Rishus Harabim, then he's chai. Chilk Marcellus Palter, but if you threw the mat into it and it split it in two, so now you have the depth, the proper depth, but each side of it is now less than 4. You don't have an area with a length and width of 4 by 4 because the machzeles, the mat itself, took up some of the space. So we're assuming at this point, that when it says the Rochav Shmeina means exactly 8. So now when you took the mat and it split it in two, if it was only exactly 8, part of now the width has been minimized by the thickness of the mat. So now each side of it is less than 4 by 4, potter. So he says, Abaye says that you're potter, because by the time the Marcel's landed, then you have each side of it is now less than the width of a Rishus HaYachid, so it has not landed in Rishus HaYachid. So l'chayr, we have to say, especially the way Rashi is learning here, that the depth of 10 is not exactly 10. It's 10 or more. It's more than 10, because otherwise, when you threw it and it landed in the first part of a bias statement, it's Zark l'soicha machselas yerchayev. Well, you would have the same issue on the depth. It was exactly 10. By the time it landed, it's no longer 10 deep. So you'd have the same issue. So by the fact that he says at the beginning, the opening statement that you're chayev, l'chayra would mean, according to Rashi, that the depth is more than 10. But the width and the length is exactly 8. So by the time you threw the mat into it and divided it and split it, now each side of it is less than 4 by 4. So he says, you're potter. So it's clear that Abaya holds that the machzelas is mevatel the mechitza. By the time when it lands, we view it that at the time of the landing, that the space was no longer a Rishus HaYachid, even though at the time that he threw it in, at the beginning of the throwing it was, but at the time it landed, it is no longer. It's a mevatel the mechitza. And your potter, kol shekein a chulya the mevatel mechitza. Certainly a chulya, we would say the same thing, that it's mevatel mechitza. Certainly we would say it in the case of where he threw the dirt into the bottom of the pit. It would be mevatel the mechitza. In that case, we would definitely say that it's mevatel the mechitza, because over there it's meant to be there on a permanent basis, so he's mevatel it. But according to Rav Yochanan, who had himself a shayla by the chulya, do we say by the rim of the bore, the edge of it, the dirt that he throws into the bottom of the bore? Rav Yochanan had a shayla. Do we say that's mevatel mechitza? So machzelas pshita d'lo mevatel mechitza. Certainly that the machzelas would not be considered to be mevatel the mechitza. It certainly would not be mevatel mechitza. Rabbiya says if you have a bore in Rishus Ram that's 10 deep and 4 wide, and it's filled with water, and you threw something into it, chayv. It's chayv. For throwing something into it, it's chayv, even though it's filled with water. Even though it's filled with water, we don't say that the water nullifies the mechitzas. The water is clear, It does not interfere with the use of the bore. If you throw something in, it could land on the bottom and stay on the bottom. So the fact that it's filled with water. So that does not constitute sealing up the bore. It does not constitute filling the bore and nullifying the mechitzas. It still retains its din as a rishus hayachid. But malaya peres v'zarach l'sayach potter. But if it is filled with fruit and malaya say is potter, there it's potter. My time maim l'mevad l'mechitzas. Also, the water does not nullify the use of the bore. It does not nullify the mechitzas. Peres mevad l'mechitzas also, but the peres do. So there's two approaches in Taisus on this. Is that the peres are mevatel the mechitzas. That is, if he intends to keep the fruit there. So if he's mevatel it, he wants it to be there. There we say it's mevatel mechitzas. But if he is not intending to keep it there, it's only there on a very temporary basis, then it would not be mevatel mechitzas. The second approach in Taisus is that even if he's not mevatel it, he does not intend to keep it there and use it, leave it there, but nevertheless, it's mevatel mechitzas because since it's filled, and it fills the bore, and the pshat is that it also nullifies the use of the bore as it's filled in, it still would be considered mevatel the mechitzas. Tanya Namihachi Zorik Mina Yam Lasrat, you have a person throws from a yam, which is and has a din of a karmelos, to a rishus haram to a street. Uminasrat liyam potter. Because it's rishus haram to karmelos to rishus harabim, so it's potter. But Rashim and Oimer Imyesh be Makam Shazorak Amakasar V'Chav Arba V'Chav Arba. But Rabbi Shimon says if in the body of water there is an indentation, there's a place on the floor of the water that has now a crevice that happens to be 4 wide and 10 deep. It has the dimensions of Rishus HaYachid. Then Chayiv. Then you're Chayiv. Why is that? Because that indentation, that bore, that pit in the area of the Yam is considered an independent Rishus HaYachid, even though the Yam itself is considered to be a karmelos. But here you have a separate area, a separate pit or an indentation that is 10 by 4. So that's considered Rishus HaYachid. It's filled with water. The entire body of water is filled with water. You must see from here, it shows you that Mayim is not mevatel the mechitza. Even though it's filled with water, it's not mevatel the mechitza. Sagt the Mishnah, if he throws something and it lands on a wall and it sticks to the wall, if it's 10 high, it's like he threw it ba'avir. The air of the space of the Rishus Haram does not extend higher than 10 tefachim off the ground. So it's l'mal mesar tefachim. That's not considered the airspace of the Rishus Harabim. It's like he threw it in the air, and therefore he's potter. L'mata mesar tefachim k'zorik baras. But if it's below 10, the airspace of the Rishus Ram extends up until 10. So if it's below 10, it's like he threw it in the Rishus Harabim, and he's chayav for it being zerik dalet ames b'Rishus Harabim. And therefore he's chayiv because someone who throws dalet amas on the Rishus Harabim, he's chayiv. He's chayiv for dalet amas on the Rishus Harabim. So below 10, if it sticks to the wall, it's considered throwing dalet amas for Rishus Harabim, and he's chayiv. If you threw it on the wall, how can he be chayiv even if it's below 10? Where is the hanocha? Where is it landing? It's talking about a sticky date. It's stuck to the wall. Stuck to the wall, it's considered munach, it's considered landed, and therefore he's chayav. If a person threw something above 10, so it's not considered throwing in the Rishus Harabim, and it landed in a small hole in the wall. Now the hole in the wall, it's above 10, so that conceivably could be a Rishus HaYachid because the Rishus Ram does not extend higher than 10. It could be a Rishus HaYachid, but to be Rishus HaYachid you need 10 high, but also dalet al dalet, and this is a chor kolshu, it's a minimal hole. So bono l'machlokes Rav Meir v'Rabbanan, whether it's considered Rishus HaYachid and he's chayav or not is dependent on the machlokes Rav Meir and the Chacham. According to Rabbi Meir, who says that you view an area that's not wide enough as if it was carved out and it achieved the requisite width, you'd be chayiv. But according to Rabbanan, so we do not apply this principle of chaykim lahashlim. We do not view an area that is not wide enough as if it's been carved out to achieve the requisite width. You're not chayiv. So according to Rabbi Meir, says that if the whole, even though it's not dalet al dalet, but if there's an area in the wall that the wall itself has that width that you could carve out, if you did carve out, you would have an area of dalet al dalet. We view it as it's carved out. According to Rabbanan, we don't say that. What's the machlokes Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim? If you have to be chayiv from mezuzah, it has to be an opening, a doorway that's at least 10 high and 4 wide. Now let's say you have a doorway that it is wide at the base, above an area of 3 tefachim from the ground, but then it narrows. And by the time, when it comes to a height of 10, it does not have that width. Rameir says as long as there is an area on the doorway that you have, it's solid area, that if you carved it out, you would have that width. Then we view it as it's carved out, and we view it as you do have that width, and you're chayiv mezuzah. Rabbanan say no. The fact that you could carve it out, we don't view it as it's carved out, and if you don't have that width, then you're potter from mezuzah. Similarly, over here, we say apply, according to Rameir, apply that principle. We view it as therefore it's a reshus yochid, even though the hole itself does not have that width, but it could be carved out to achieve the width. We view it as it's carved out. According to Rabbanan, we do not apply that principle, and he would be potter. It's not considered to be a reshus yochid. Tanya Namahachi Zark Lamala Mesar Vahalcha Venacha Bukhara Kol Shui threw higher than 10, it landed in a small hole. Rameir Machai, Rameir Schai Zirchai V'Champaichen. A new halacha of Yudam Arav Tel Hamislakid Asara B'Sech Arba. If you have a mound, so it's sloping, and it slopes to a height of 10, and within a area of 4. So by the time it reaches a height of 10 tefachim from the ground, it does that with an area of 4 amas. So therefore it's considered to be a steep enough incline. It's considered to be like a mound that's 10 high, and it's 10 high off the ground. Since the slope, the incline, is steep enough that by the time it's within dalet amas, it reaches the height of 10 tefachim. That's considered to be not part of the contour of the land. That's considered to be a mound, which is 10 high off the ground. And as we learned before, if you have a mound or a rock that's 10 high or more above the ground and has width and length of dalet al dalet, that's a reshus yochid, and if you threw it on there, then it's high. Tanya Namachi. So we learned in the same way, meaning that if it has that steep incline, it's considered to be not part of the contour of the land, then you're chayiv. Meaning, and if it's less, if by the time it reaches 10, it's not within a distance of dalet amas. It takes more. It's not as steep. It only reaches a height of 10 when it's more a distance that's more than dalet amas. So the incline is not that steep. If it's less than that, so therefore it's considered part of the contour of the land. It's not considered a separate area off the reshus harabim, and you'd be potter. So if you have a mavi sheshavel soyach v'nasa madon reshus harabim, if you have a mavi. Now, in a mavoi, when you have a side street that's open to the main street, so if you have the walls of the mavoi, you have the street, the reshus harabim, you cannot carry in the side street unless it has an adjustment with a lechi or a kaira, unless there is a crossbeam that now you have a crossbeam, then you can carry in the side street, or you have a post you have a post on it that allows you to carry in the street. There's a back wall here, there's the wall side walls, but now it's open to the Rishus HaRabim, you need a lechi or kair. If the area of the street is level, but that side street has a different elevation than the Rishus HaRabim. So, but when it comes to the Rishus HaRabim, it's the slopes to the Rishus HaRabim. It's higher, the elevation is higher than the street, and when you come to the street, it slopes down. So this is a higher elevation, the street is a lower elevation. Or the street is a higher elevation. As you come to the entrance of the Mavoi, it's level, but then there's a sharp incline, and it now has a lower elevation. The Mavi does not need in such a case a lechi or kaira, because since it has a higher or lower elevation, then in itself is considered to be like a lechi or a kaira, because there's a clear differentiation between the two areas. One is higher and lower than the other. That's a separation between the two areas, which implies that so therefore, if you have something that there's a sharp difference in the elevation, it's considered separate from the rest of that area. And similarly, it says if you have this mound that it reaches a height of 10, it's a higher elevation of 10, within a distance of Arba, within a distance of Arba Amas, that's considered to be a separate elevation, a separate area. It's not considered part of the contour of the land, and therefore it's like a mound that's 10 high, 4 by 4. If someone throws from the street on top of it, that's a separate rishus. It's separate from the rest of the rishus, and he threw from the Rishus HaRabim to Rishus HaYachid, is chayiv. But of course, that also implies that if it's not so steep, it takes a larger distance to get to a height of 10. It's more than Dalet Amas laterally until it gets to a vertical height of 10 off the ground. Then it's considered part of the contour of the land. It's not considered a separate, distinct area, and then you'd be potter. It's only if it's so steep that within an area of Dalet Amas laterally along the area, it already reaches a height of 10, that's considered separate from the ground area, and then he would be chayv in that case. Sagt the Mishnah, if a person threw within Dalet Amas, so he did not throw Dalet Amas along the Rishus HaRabim. He threw Dalet Amas, but then it was pushed beyond the Dalet Amas, then it's potter. So if he threw within the area that he threw it in, it was not Dalet Amas. So he didn't throw Dalet Amas to Rishus HaRabim. It was within Dalet Amas. But then a gust of wind blew it further, and now it's beyond the Dalet Amas. So Saif, at the end of the day, it is 4 Amas from where he threw. But nevertheless, he's potter, because his initial throw was less than Dalet Amas. Now, even though ultimately it landed more than Dalet Amas away from where he's standing, but that's not part of his throwing. His throwing was a distance of less than Dalet Amas. But on the other hand, the opposite is true. If he threw, his initial throw was more than Dalet Amas, so he threw Dalet Amas, it's Dalet Amas of Rishus HaRabim. Even though the wind pushed it back in, he's chayav because his initial throw was Dalet Amas of Rishus HaRabim. Well, what do you mean? In order to say, the Reish is saying he threw it within Dalet Amas, the wind pushed it further, but it didn't land. So why isn't that all part and parcel of his throwing? He threw it. Ultimately, it landed Dalet Amas away in the Rishus HaRabim. Why isn't that considered to be Dalet Amas? Now, what we mean to say in the Reish is he threw it less than Dalet Amas. It landed on a small protrusion, on a small little area, or even, as we'll see, that's moved from the Gemara, even if it didn't land, but it was suspended in the air. So we view his initial throwing as throwing it less than Dalet Ames. Now, even if afterwards a gust of wind pushed it beyond the Dalet Ames, but his initial throwing ended with that noch al ziz mashu, on something al gabi mashu, or on being suspended in the air. Then even if the gust of wind ultimately pushed it beyond, that's not part of his throwing. In the Seifa, if he threw a Dalet Ames, his throwing was Dalet Ames or more in the Rishus Rabbim Yischaim. It landed on something, on mashu, it got suspended in the air, then the gust of wind pushed it back in, but his initial throwing was Dalet Ames, and he's chayiv. Tanya namahach is zorak chus Dalet Ames dachvas haruach v'achnisosa, and a gust of wind pushed it back in, v'afal pisha chazer v'aitzi also, potter. So he threw more than Dalet Ames, but ruach, and the wind pushed it back in, and even though it then pushed it back out, he's potter. But ruach mashu, but if it was suspended in the air, even though it pushed it back in, he's chayiv, because his initial throwing was terminated when it was suspended in the air. So if he threw it, Zorak chutz l'Dalet Ames, it was not suspended and brought it back in. He's potter, because at the end of the day, his throwing was less than Dalet Ames. But if he threw it and it was noch, it was viewed as being noch, either on gabi mash or suspended in the air, that's the termination of his throwing. It was Dalet Ames Yitzchayv, even though ultimately got pushed back in. That's a different action. That's a different achnosa, bringing it back in, which is not related to his throwing. He's chayav for his action of throwing, even though ultimately it landed within the Dalet Ames. That's a new maisa, and he's chayav for what he threw.